The morning sun peeked through the tall buildings, painting the streets in soft gold. People hurried past with coffee cups, briefcases, and phones in hand. In the middle of all that rush sat an old woman on a worn-out blanket, her back slightly bent but her spirit still strong. Beside her was a little girl no more than 4 years old, holding a half-eaten piece of bread. The woman's wrinkled hands were wrapped around a small paper cup that once held coffee, now used to collect coins from kind strangers. For most people passing by, they were just another sight on the busy sidewalk, an elderly woman and a child sitting quietly with tired eyes. But behind those eyes was a story that could melt even the coldest heart. The woman's name was Eleanor, though few people ever asked. Life had once been kinder to her. She had worked for many years as a piano teacher in a small music school on the edge of town. She had a husband once, a home, and a daughter who meant the world to her. But life, unpredictable as it is, had slowly taken all that away. Her husband passed many years ago. Her daughter, who had always been full of dreams, lost her battle with illness, leaving behind her only child, little Lila. Lila was 4 now, with curious brown eyes that looked at the world with wonder. She didn't understand what it meant to be homeless. To her, the streets were simply outside, a place where she could skip, hum songs, and look at the bright lights in shop windows. She often told her grandmother, "One day we'll have a house with windows that open to the sun." Eleanor would smile gently, holding back tears, and say, "Yes, my darling." One day, the city was not kind to those without a home. Nights were cold, and the sound of footsteps and engines replaced the lullabies Eleanor used to sing. Still, she tried to make each day feel normal for Lila. Every morning, she'd brush the little girl's hair with a small comb she carried in her coat pocket. Then she'd hum a soft tune, something that once came from the piano keys she missed so much. Music had been Eleanor's language. It was how she expressed joy, sorrow, and everything in between. Even though her hands now trembled, the memory of melodies still lived in her heart. Sometimes, when the city grew quieter, she would close her eyes and imagine herself sitting before a grand piano, her fingers dancing across the keys, filling the air with the sound of hope. But now, her fingers were cold, her nails chipped, and her piano was long gone. Lila often asked her about the past. "Grandma, did you really play music that made people clap?" she would ask, her voice full of wonder. Eleanor would smile softly. "Yes, sweetheart. When I was young, I played for people who listened with their hearts, and when the music ended, they smiled even if they had been sad before." Lila's eyes would widen. "Can you teach me to play too?" she'd ask. Eleanor's throat would tighten. "One day when we find a piano again." Each day they found small kindnesses in unexpected places. A cafe owner sometimes gave them leftover muffins. A student passing by would drop a coin or two in their paper cup. There were also people who looked away quickly, pretending not to see them. But Eleanor never let bitterness take over. She had learned long ago that kindness grows where gratitude lives, even in the hardest of times. The days were long and the nights seemed even longer. The winter air crept through their thin blankets. Eleanor often stayed awake, keeping watch as Lila slept beside her, curled up under her old coat. She would whisper soft lullabies, remembering the days when her home had warmth and her piano sat by the window. The sound of those memories was enough to keep her heart alive. One afternoon, as they walked near the old train station, the wind carried faint music from somewhere. Lila stopped and tugged on her grandmother's sleeve. "Grandma, someone's playing," she said excitedly. They followed the sound until they came to a small open square near the entrance of the station. There, covered in dust and scratches, stood an old public piano. Its paint was chipped and a few keys were missing, but to Eleanor it looked like a treasure. She stood still for a moment, staring at it. Memories flooded her mind. The soft touch of ivory keys, the echo of applause, the warmth of shared music. Lila noticed the look in her grandmother's eyes and whispered, "Can you play, Grandma?" Eleanor hesitated. Her hands were stiff and she hadn't touched an instrument in years. She was afraid the notes wouldn't sound the same anymore, that her gift had been lost to time. But then she looked at Lila, whose little face was full of hope, and something inside her stirred. Maybe it was time to let the music live again. She stepped closer to the piano, brushing off the dust from the top. Her fingers trembled as she pressed a single key. It made a dull sound, slightly off-tune but still alive. She pressed another, then another, and before long her hands began to remember what her heart had never forgotten. The music started soft and slow, like a whisper carried by the wind. People walking by began to slow down. The sound was rough but beautiful, imperfect yet full of emotion. Lila stood beside her, swaying to the rhythm, her tiny hands clasped in front of her chest. Her grandmother's music seemed to paint the air with memories, sadness, and love all at once. A few people gathered around, curious. Some pulled out their phones. Others just stood there, listening. They didn't see a homeless woman anymore. They saw an artist, someone who had lived, lost, and still found a way to create beauty in the middle of pain. Lila looked up at her grandmother with eyes full of pride. "Grandma," she whispered, "it sounds like magic." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Music is magic, my dear. It speaks when words fail." When the song ended, silence filled the air for a moment. Then softly, someone began to clap. The sound grew louder as more people joined in. Tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes. She hadn't heard applause in decades. For a brief moment, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, heard, remembered. Someone dropped a few bills into the paper cup on the ground. Others followed. One woman knelt down and said softly, "That was beautiful." Eleanor thanked her, her voice trembling. But what touched her most wasn't the money. It was the way people looked at her, with kindness instead of pity. When the crowd began to leave, Eleanor sat quietly, still lost in the echo of the notes. Lila hugged her waist tightly. "Can we come back tomorrow?" the little girl asked. Eleanor nodded, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's face. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll come back." As the sun began to set, the two of them walked away hand in hand. The world around them was still harsh, but something had changed. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt light in her heart, a soft flame of hope that refused to go out. That night, as they settled under their blanket near the station wall, Lila whispered, "Grandma, when you play, people smile. Maybe we can make everyone happy." Eleanor held her close and whispered back, "Maybe, my dear. Maybe music is how we'll find our way home." And as Lila drifted off to sleep, Eleanor stared up at the stars, her heart full of both sadness and gratitude. She had nothing left but her love and her music. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start again. The next morning, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. The streets were wet from a light rain that had fallen during the night. Small puddles shimmered on the sidewalk as people hurried by, umbrellas in hand. Eleanor sat under the old awning, near the train station, holding a small piece of bread for breakfast. Beside her, little Lila sat quietly, drawing shapes in the damp ground with a stick. The sound of trains came and went, blending with the chatter of the city. Eleanor looked across the street at the same piano they had found the day before. Even from a distance, she could see the dust still settled on its keys, the faded paint, the missing notes. Yet in her eyes, it was beautiful. That piano had brought her back to life, if only for a few minutes. It had reminded her of who she once was, and perhaps who she could still be. Lila followed her grandmother's gaze. "Can we go play again?" she asked eagerly, her small voice breaking through the morning air. Eleanor smiled gently. "You really liked it, didn't you?" Lila nodded quickly, her curls bouncing. "You made people happy. They were smiling. I want to see that again." Eleanor hesitated. Her old fingers still ached from the cold, and her joints felt stiff. But deep down, she wanted to feel those keys again, to hear that sound that connected her to her past and her purpose. So she gathered her strength, helped Lila to her feet, and together they crossed the street toward the piano. The rain had stopped, but the keys were still slightly wet. Eleanor wiped them gently with her sleeve before sitting down. A few people glanced their way, but most just walked by. She placed her trembling fingers on the keys and pressed softly. The first few notes sounded broken and uneven. She paused, then tried again. Slowly, the melody began to take shape, a gentle tune that carried sadness and beauty all at once. Lila stood beside her, watching closely. After a moment, she began to hum along, her soft voice blending with the uneven piano sound. It was a simple tune, but something about it drew attention. A man on his way to work stopped for a moment. Then a woman with a shopping bag paused too. Before long, a few more people had gathered. Eleanor didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the keys, her fingers moving as though guided by memory rather than sight. She wasn't playing for money, or even for applause. She was playing because music was the one thing life hadn't taken from her. Lila's humming grew stronger, and she began to sing softly, making up words as she went. Her voice was pure and full of light, the kind that could make anyone stop and listen. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence and then the sound of gentle clapping. Lila looked around, surprised and delighted. Eleanor smiled softly, feeling tears sting her eyes. It wasn't much, just a small group of strangers, clapping on a rainy morning, but to her it felt like the world had opened its heart. A man approached them and dropped a few coins into the paper cup at their feet. "That was beautiful," he said warmly. "You should play more often." Eleanor thanked him quietly. She didn't know how to explain what it meant to hear those words. For years her music had been silent. Now it was alive again. They stayed for a while longer, playing little songs, some happy, some slow. Each time Eleanor played, Lila would sing or dance beside her, spreading joy in her own innocent way. More people stopped. Some recorded short clips on their phones. Others simply smiled and went on with their day. But something magical had begun, something small, yet powerful. By late afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across the square. Lila and Eleanor decided to rest. They sat on the bench near the piano, sharing the muffin a kind stranger had given them. Lila swung her legs happily. "Grandma," she said between bites, "maybe if we play every day, people will remember us." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Maybe they will, my dear. But even if they don't, we'll still have the music." That night, they found shelter near the back of an old cafe that stayed open late. The owner recognized them from the square and offered them a warm drink. "I saw the video," he said with a smile. "Someone posted it online. You and the little one were wonderful." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Video?" she asked. "Yes," he nodded. "A young man filmed you this morning. It's spreading fast. People are talking about you two." Eleanor didn't quite understand how something could spread on the internet, but she felt both nervous and hopeful. She had never sought attention, yet the idea that their music could touch people far beyond the street seemed like a miracle. The next morning when they returned to the piano, something was different. A small group was already waiting. A woman smiled and waved at Lila. "Play the song again," she called. Eleanor hesitated, surprised, but Lila giggled and ran to her spot beside the piano. Eleanor took a deep breath, sat down, and began to play. This time the sound was stronger, the rhythm steadier. Lila's voice rose like sunlight breaking through clouds. People gathered again, some clapping softly to the beat, others recording on their phones. When they finished, a man came forward and handed Eleanor a small envelope. "For you," he said. "You reminded me of my grandmother. She loved music too." Eleanor opened the envelope later that day and found a small note inside. It read, "Thank you for reminding us that beauty still lives in the world." Inside were a few folded bills, more than she had seen in months. She pressed it to her chest, tears filling her eyes. It wasn't the money that made her cry. It was the kindness. As the days went on, Eleanor and Lila became part of the square. People began to recognize them. Some brought food, others brought flowers. One day a young woman brought a small pink coat for Lila, saying, "I thought she could use something warm." Lila twirled around happily in her new coat, while Eleanor whispered a heartfelt thank you. Still, there were hard nights. The city grew colder and Eleanor's body felt weaker each day. But every morning when she saw Lila's eager smile, she found the strength to return to the piano. The music seemed to give her energy, as though it were keeping her alive. One evening, as the crowd around them began to thin, Eleanor noticed a little boy standing alone, watching quietly. His parents were nearby, taking pictures. The boy stepped closer and asked shyly, "Can you play something happy?" Eleanor smiled and nodded. She began to play a soft, cheerful tune that she used to play for her daughter many years ago. Lila clapped her hands to the rhythm, laughing as the boys started to dance. The crowd began to laugh and cheer too. For a few minutes, everyone forgot their worries. The music filled the air with warmth and light. When the song ended, the boy's mother came forward, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "That was the most beautiful thing I've seen in a long time." After everyone left, Eleanor sat in silence for a while, her hands resting gently on the piano keys. The sound of laughter still echoed in her mind. She turned to Lila, who was yawning beside her. "Did you see their smiles, my dear?" Lila nodded sleepily. "They were happy, Grandma. You made them happy." Eleanor smiled. "No, my love, we made them happy." As they walked back to their corner near the train station that night, Lila looked up at the stars. "Grandma, do you think Mommy can hear you play from the sky?" she asked innocently. Eleanor paused for a moment, her eyes glistening. "Yes," she whispered softly. "I believe she can, and I think she's very proud." The days continued like that, filled with small miracles and simple joys. The piano became their friend, their home, their voice. Each note carried a story, each song a memory. The people who stopped to listen didn't just hear music, they heard love, loss, and hope woven together. Eleanor knew that she couldn't change the world, but she had changed her small corner of it. And for her, that was enough. The music had found its way back into her life, and through it, she had found something even greater. Connection, kindness, and a sense of belonging she thought she had lost forever. That night, as she and Lila huddled together under their blanket, the little girl whispered, "Grandma, promise me we'll play again tomorrow." Eleanor brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed her softly. "I promise, my dear," she said with a smile. "As long as I can play, we'll never stop." And with that promise, the two drifted off to sleep. A grandmother and her granddaughter, dreaming under the stars, holding on to music and to each other. The next morning arrived with a soft breeze and the sound of early traffic. The city was slowly waking up. The light spread across the buildings, touching the old piano by the train station where Eleanor and little Lila had spent the last few weeks bringing music to strangers. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands wrapped around a small cup of tea that a kind cafe worker had given her. Lila sat beside her, humming a tune to herself as she played with a little paper boat she had folded from an old flyer. The world around them was still busy and full of rush, but for a moment they felt calm. People had started to recognize them now. Every day someone would stop by the square, waiting to hear the old woman play and the little girl sing. Some brought coins, others brought food or small gifts. And though life was still difficult, Eleanor felt that something in her heart had changed. She was no longer invisible. That morning, as they prepared to play, a man carrying a camera approached them. He looked kind and respectful. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I'm from a local newspaper. Everyone in town has been talking about you two. Would you mind if I filmed your performance?" Eleanor hesitated. She had never liked attention, and she didn't quite understand how videos and newspapers worked. But then she looked down at Lila, whose eyes sparkled with excitement. "Grandma, we can show Mommy our song if he films it," she whispered. Eleanor smiled faintly, her heart aching at the mention of her late daughter. She nodded. "All right," she said softly. "We'll play." Lila's tiny hands clapped together in joy as Eleanor sat down at the piano. The man adjusted his camera quietly, careful not to disturb them. Then with a deep breath, Eleanor began to play. The tune started slow and gentle, the kind that could make the whole world pause. Her fingers moved across the keys like they were remembering an old friend. Then Lila began to sing, her little voice pure and soft, rising above the noise of the street. People walking by turned their heads. One by one, they began to stop. Soon a small crowd had gathered again, standing in a half-circle around the piano. Some smiled, others closed their eyes, just listening. The combination of the old woman's worn hands and the young girl's innocent voice created something that touched everyone's heart. Lila sang words she made up on the spot. About love, about stars, about how her grandma's music could make the sky shine. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was full of heart. When the song ended, silence filled the air for a brief moment before applause broke out. The crowd clapped, some even cheered softly. A few people had tears in their eyes. Eleanor bowed her head slightly, humbled. She wasn't used to praise. For years she had played for herself, for her students, or for her daughter. Now she played for strangers, and somehow it mattered more than she ever imagined. The man with the camera smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said. "That was incredible." He uploaded the video later that day, writing a short caption. An 87-year-old grandmother and her 4-year-old granddaughter remind us that music and love can survive anything. Neither Eleanor nor Lila knew what would happen next. That evening, as they sat near the train station eating a warm sandwich someone had given them, a young woman approached, holding her phone. "Did you know you're famous?" she said, smiling. "Your video is everywhere. People are talking about you online. Thousands of comments. They all love you." Eleanor looked confused. "Everywhere?" she asked softly. The young woman nodded. "Yes. People are crying watching it. They say you and your granddaughter are the most beautiful thing they've seen in a long time." Eleanor didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to the idea of strangers knowing her name, her face, or her story. She was simply a woman who had lost much but still found comfort in a piano and her granddaughter's laughter. Yet now her music had reached places she could never walk to. That night, as Lila lay curled up beside her, Eleanor stared up at the stars. She whispered, "Maybe your mommy helped us somehow, my dear. Maybe she wanted people to hear us." Lila's eyes fluttered sleepily. "Do you think mommy's happy?" she asked. Eleanor kissed her forehead. "Yes, my love. I think she's smiling every time we play." The next day brought even more surprises. When they returned to the piano, a large crowd had already gathered. Some people held flowers, others had little signs that read, "Thank you for the music." Eleanor's heart raced. She wasn't sure she could play in front of so many people, but when she saw Lila's bright smile, all her fear melted away. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play again, a soft melody that floated through the air like sunlight. Lila began to sing, and once more the crowd fell silent, completely enchanted. Some people filmed again, but others simply listened, holding hands, standing shoulder to shoulder in quiet awe. One man wiped his eyes and whispered to another, "It's strange how something so simple can make you feel so much." After the song, people came forward to speak to them. A woman offered to buy them lunch. Another man said, "You've reminded us that kindness still exists." A small child gave Lila a red balloon. It was the first toy she had in a long time. She held it tightly, her face glowing with happiness. Later that afternoon, a local musician approached Eleanor. He introduced himself gently and said, "I run a small music charity. We help people who've fallen on hard times, and especially artists. We'd love to do something for you and your granddaughter." Eleanor was speechless. "Oh, I don't need much," she said humbly. But the man smiled. "You've already given this city something priceless. Let us give something back." He took down her details and promised to return in a few days. As the evening sun began to set, Eleanor looked at the piano with gratitude. It had been broken, forgotten, and left to rust, just like her once. But somehow they had both come back to life. The old instrument had found its song again, and she had found her strength. That night, the two of them sat quietly near their little corner. Lila was playing with her balloon, giggling softly. Eleanor watched her and smiled. "You know," she said gently, "sometimes life gives us the smallest things that lead to the biggest miracles." Lila tilted her head. "Like the piano?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, exactly like the piano." Days passed and their fame grew. More videos appeared online, different angles, different songs. People from other cities began to visit the square just to see them. Some brought gifts, others just wanted to listen. A few even said their story had inspired them to help the homeless in their own neighborhoods. Eleanor couldn't believe it. All she had wanted was to share a little music. Now it was changing lives, not just hers but others too. But even with all the attention, she remained humble. Each morning she still brushed Lila's hair, shared whatever food they had, and whispered, "Let's make someone smile today." She didn't play for fame or money, she played because it made her granddaughter happy. One afternoon, as they finished another song, a young reporter came forward. "People all over the world want to know your story," he said kindly. Would you like to tell them where you come from? Eleanor looked down at Lila, then back at him. We come from love, she said simply. And music. That's all anyone really needs. The man smiled, deeply moved. That night they slept under the same stars as always. But something in the air felt different. There was hope, real, living hope, and it was growing all around them. Eleanor closed her eyes, whispering a silent thank you for everything that had happened. In the distance, the piano stood still under the dim light of the street lamps. It had become a symbol now, not of sadness but of resilience. People who passed by when they weren't there would still stop and look at it, remembering the grandmother and the little girl whose music made strangers cry, smile, and believe again. Eleanor didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she did know this. As long as she had Lila and that piano, she could face anything, and as she drifted off to sleep, with Lila's tiny hand resting in hers, she whispered softly, "We're not alone anymore, my dear. The world is listening." The morning air felt different that day. The sky was clear, the light soft and golden, and there was a strange sense of peace in the air. Eleanor woke before Lila, as she often did, and looked at the little girl sleeping beside her, wrapped in the old coat someone had given them. The faintest smile touched Eleanor's lips. Lila's face was calm, her small hand resting on her grandmother's arm. For a moment, Eleanor simply watched her breathe, feeling thankful that they had made it this far. The last few days had been full of surprises. The video of them performing had spread everywhere. People had started visiting from far away just to see them play. The world that once rushed past them without a glance was now slowing down to listen. That morning, when Eleanor and Lila reached the piano, there was already a small group waiting. Someone had cleaned the piano overnight and even left a bunch of fresh flowers on top of it. A sign hung from the corner, written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for reminding us what love sounds like." Eleanor's heart swelled. She touched the flowers gently and whispered, "Bless the kind soul who did this." When she began to play, it felt like the piano responded differently, as if it too felt alive again. The music filled the square, flowing like sunlight. Lila stood beside her, singing softly, her voice clearer than ever. The people listening swayed gently, lost in the warmth of the melody. Some smiled, others wiped their eyes. After the song, a woman stepped forward holding a microphone. She introduced herself kindly and said, "I'm from a local television station. We'd love to share your story with everyone. Would that be all right?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, but the woman's tone was gentle, not pushy. "We don't have much to tell," she said quietly. "Just an old woman and a little girl trying to bring some happiness," the woman smiled. That's exactly what people need to hear. That evening, their story was broadcast on the local news. The video showed Eleanor's wrinkled hands moving gracefully over the keys, and Lila's bright voice singing beside her. The reporter spoke about how two people with almost nothing had touched the hearts of thousands. The next morning, when Eleanor woke, something astonishing had happened. The story had spread beyond their city. Messages of love and support came from all over the world. People wanted to help, not just with words, but with actions. By noon, a small team from a charity organization arrived. They explained they had seen the story and wanted to offer Eleanor and Lila a place to stay. A real home, with a bed, a kitchen, and warmth. Eleanor was speechless. For a moment, she thought it was a dream. "You mean, a real home?" she whispered. "Yes," one of them said kindly. "You won't have to sleep on the street anymore. You and your granddaughter deserve better." Lila's eyes widened in amazement. "We get a house, Grandma? With windows and a door?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. Eleanor nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, my love," she whispered. "A house with windows and a door." The crowd around them clapped softly. People smiled, some crying as they watched the moment unfold. A few even offered to help move their few belongings. That night, for the first time in a long while, Eleanor and Lila slept in a real bed. The room was small but clean. There was a soft rug, a tiny kitchen, and a window that let the moonlight in. Lila ran around the room laughing, her tiny feet patting on the wooden floor. "Look, Grandma," she said, pointing out the window. "I can see the stars from inside." Eleanor sat on the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she looked around. Everything felt unreal, the warmth, the quiet, the feeling of safety. She whispered a prayer of thanks under her breath. When Lila finally fell asleep, Eleanor stayed awake a while longer, sitting by the window. The world outside looked different from up here. The same streets that once felt cruel now seemed softer somehow. She thought about the strangers who had helped them, the ones who had stopped to listen, the ones who had shared food, the ones who had written kind messages. Maybe, she thought, there was more goodness in the world than she had ever imagined. The following day, the charity worker returned. "There's one more thing," he said with a smile. "A music company saw your video. They'd like to donate a piano for your home, if that's all right with you," Eleanor gasped. "A piano? For us?" "Yes," he nodded. "They said no musician should ever be without one." When the piano arrived a few days later, Eleanor could hardly believe it. It wasn't grand or fancy, just a simple upright piano, polished and perfect. She ran her hand across the smooth surface, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Welcome home," she whispered to it softly. That evening, she sat down to play and Lila stood beside her, ready to sing. The sound filled the little room, bouncing off the walls, turning the air into something almost magical. For the first time in years, they weren't performing for strangers or coins. They were playing for themselves, for the joy of it. Soon their home became a gathering place for neighbors. People would drop by to listen or simply to say hello. Lila would serve them tea in tiny cups, proud of their new kitchen. Eleanor's music became part of the neighborhood's daily rhythm, a soft melody that drifted through open windows and made people smile. One afternoon, the same man who had filmed them weeks earlier returned. He wanted to record them again, this time in their new home. "People want to see how you're doing," he said kindly. Eleanor agreed. She sat at her piano, Lila standing beside her, and they played the same song they had played on the street that first night. But this time everything was different. There was warmth, safety, and love surrounding them. When the video went online, it spread even faster than the first. Millions of people watched, moved to tears. The comments were full of hope. "This is what the world needs. Love wins. Music heals." Eleanor read a few of them and smiled. "People are so kind," she said softly. "All because of one little song." Lila giggled. "It was a big song, Grandma. It made everyone happy." Eleanor laughed quietly. "Maybe you're right, my dear." As the weeks passed, they began to rebuild their lives. Lila started attending a small preschool nearby. The teachers adored her cheerful nature and her love for music. She would often tell them proudly, "My grandma plays piano for everyone." Eleanor spent her mornings teaching a few neighborhood children how to play simple tunes. She never charged anyone. "Music is meant to be shared," she would say. "It's a gift that grows the more you give it away." Every evening she and Lila would sit by the window watching the sunset together. They didn't have much, just a small home, a piano, and each other. But to them, it was everything. One night, as the light faded outside, Eleanor looked at her granddaughter and said, "Do you know why music is special, my love?" Lila tilted her head. "Why?" "Because it never disappears," Eleanor said softly. "Even when the song ends, the feeling stays in people's hearts. That's what we gave to the world, not just music but love." Lila thought about that for a moment, then smiled. "Then let's never stop, Grandma." Eleanor took her tiny hand and held it gently. "We won't, my dear. We'll play for as long as we can." Outside, the stars began to appear one by one, twinkling above their new home. The sound of laughter echoed from the street below, mingling with the faint memory of piano notes that had once floated through the cold night air. Eleanor closed her eyes and smiled. She knew that their journey wasn't over. It had only changed direction. From the streets to the stage of life, from loneliness to love, they had found something that no amount of money could buy: hope. And as the moonlight fell softly across the keys of her piano, she whispered the same words she had told Lila so many times before. "When we play, the world listens." Months had passed since the day Eleanor and Lila had been given their new home. The cold nights on the street felt like a faraway memory now. Every morning, sunlight streamed through their small window, landing right on the piano that stood proudly in the corner. The house smelled of tea and fresh bread, and laughter often echoed through its walls. Eleanor had grown thinner but looked more peaceful than ever. The deep lines on her face seemed softer somehow. She moved slowly, her steps careful, but her eyes still carried the same spark they had when she first touched that old street piano. Lila had grown taller, Her hair was a little longer now, always tied up with colorful ribbons that neighbors often brought her. She had started school and made friends easily. Everyone loved her sweet nature and her love for singing. Every afternoon when she came home, she would drop her little backpack on the floor and run straight to the piano. "Let's play, Grandma," she'd shout. Eleanor would always smile. "Of course, my dear. Let's make music for the world again." Together, they filled their small home with songs. The same songs that once echoed through the cold streets now danced through the warm air of their little home. Neighbors often stopped outside their window just to listen. Some would close their eyes and smile. Others would whisper to each other about how lucky they were to live nearby. Soon, invitations began to arrive. The charity group that had helped them was organizing a community concert, an event to bring people together and raise funds for others who were struggling. They wanted Eleanor and Lila to perform. At first, Eleanor hesitated. "Oh, I'm too old for big stages," she said. But Lila clasped her hand tightly and looked up at her with pleading eyes. "Please, Grandma. We can make everyone happy again." Eleanor couldn't say no to that face. "All right," she said softly. "But only if you promise to sing with all your heart." "I promise," Lila said with a grin. The following days were filled with excitement. Eleanor practiced for hours, making sure her fingers still remembered every note. Though her hands trembled sometimes, the sound that came from the piano was pure and full of emotion. Lila practiced too, her small voice ringing clear and bright, growing stronger with each song. The night of the concert arrived. The hall was filled with people. Families, children, and even strangers who had seen their story online came to see them perform. The lights were warm and golden. Eleanor sat quietly backstage, her heart beating fast. It had been decades since she'd played for such a large audience. She looked down at Lila, who was adjusting her little dress. "Are you nervous, my love?" she asked. Lila shook her head. "No, are you?" Eleanor laughed softly. "A little. But as long as you're beside me, I'll be fine." When their names were called, the audience clapped. They walked onto the stage hand in hand. The piano gleamed under the lights. Eleanor took her seat slowly, and Lila stood beside her, smiling shyly at the crowd. Eleanor placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The hall grew silent. The melody was slow and tender at first, like a whisper. Then as Lila began to sing, the music grew stronger. Her voice floated through the air, innocent and full of hope. The sound reached every corner of the room. Some people held their breath, others wiped away tears. The bond between the two was so powerful that you could feel it in every note. It wasn't just a song, it was a story told through music. A story of loss, love, and miracles. When the last note faded, the silence in the room lingered for a moment before the applause began. It was thunderous, warm, and endless. People stood up, clapping and cheering. Eleanor looked at Lila, tears in her eyes. Lila smiled and threw her arms around her grandmother's neck. "We did it, Grandma," she whispered. Eleanor held her close, her heart full. "Yes, my dear," she said softly. "We did it." After the concert, reporters came to speak with them, but Eleanor didn't talk much about herself. She only said, "We just wanted to share a little love. Music helped us survive, and maybe it can help others too." The concert raised enough money to help several other families find shelter. The organizers were overjoyed, and they credited Eleanor and Lila for inspiring people to give. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm after that. Eleanor continued to teach music to neighborhood children for free, and Lila sang in her school choir. Sometimes they performed small songs for the neighbors in the courtyard. The same kindness they had once received, they now gave freely to others. One sunny afternoon, a young woman from the Music Foundation visited their home. "We have something special for you," she said, handing Eleanor a large envelope. Inside was an invitation to perform at a national music event, a festival that celebrated musicians who had inspired the world. Eleanor stared at the letter in disbelief. "Oh my," she whispered. "They want an old woman like me?" The woman smiled. "They don't see an old woman, ma'am. They see a legend, someone who reminded the world that music has no age, no home, and no limits." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Well, I don't know about that. But if it means more people can hear my granddaughter sing, then we'll go." And so they did. The festival was held in a grand auditorium. Musicians from all over the country performed. But when it was Eleanor and Lila's turn, the hall grew quiet again, just as it had the first time. She sat at the piano, her hands trembling slightly, while Lila stood beside her in a simple white dress. They played the same song that had once echoed through the streets, the song that had started everything. The audience listened with tears in their eyes. When the last note faded, the hall erupted in applause. Some people stood up cheering. Others simply smiled through their tears. That night, their performance was broadcast nationwide. People across the country watched and wrote messages of love and admiration. Strangers sent letters saying the music had touched their hearts. Some said it gave them hope when they had none. Eleanor read the letters slowly, her hands trembling slightly, her heart full. "It's amazing," she said one evening. "We were invisible once, and now the whole world is listening." Lila hugged her tightly. "It's because of your music, Grandma," Eleanor smiled. "No, my love. It's because of our music." As time passed, their story became more than just a video or a concert. It became a symbol. Schools invited them to talk about kindness, hope, and never giving up. Musicians spoke about how one old woman and one small girl reminded them why they started playing in the first place. But through it all, Eleanor stayed humble. She never saw herself as famous. She still woke up early, made tea, and sat by the piano every morning. And every time she played, she began with the same quiet prayer of gratitude. One evening, after another long day of music and laughter, Lila climbed into her grandmother's lap. "Grandma, will we always play together?" she asked softly. Eleanor smiled and stroked her hair. "For as long as we can, my dear. And even when we can't, the music will still be there. You'll play and I'll be listening. Maybe from somewhere you can't see, but I'll always hear you." Lila pressed her ear against her grandmother's chest. "Then I'll keep playing forever," she said. Eleanor kissed her forehead. "That's my girl." Years later, people would still remember them, the old woman and the little girl who played the piano by the station. Their story would be told in classrooms, music halls, and homes. Some people would say it was about music. Others would say it was about love. But those who truly understood knew it was about something deeper, the power of kindness, the beauty of hope, and the magic that happens when two hearts refuse to give up. And on quiet nights, when the city streets fell silent, some swore they could still hear faint piano notes drifting through the air. Soft, gentle, and full of love. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was Eleanor and Lila, still playing somewhere, reminding the world that music never really ends.